Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to part 2 of the Politics and Media show. The disorder which rocked Britain's streets in August shocked authorities and the general public alike. It left many scratching their heads and searching for reasons as to why thousands of mainly young people suddenly took to the streets to riot and loot in what was seen as the biggest challenge for law and order in a generation. The Riots, Communities and Victims panel recently found that a lack of confidence in the police response to the initial riots in London led to further disturbances across England. Now, new research by The Guardian and the London School of Economics has revealed that many Muslims involved in the disorder said that racial discrimination by the police had fueled their anger and lawlessness. Before I introduce today's guests, let's take a quick look back at the August riots.
On August the 4th, an unarmed father of 4, Mike Duggan, was shot dead by Metropolitan Police in Tottenham, North London. His death sparked riots in the area, which soon spread across London boroughs and then to other parts of England. It was the worst civil unrest seen in the UK for a generation. Shops were looted, buildings set alight, and police were targeted by rioters. The government's response to the unrest was a declaration of war, a war on gangs.
This is criminality, pure and simple, and it has to be confronted and defeated. And I have this very clear message to those people who are responsible for this wrongdoing and criminality. You will feel the full force of the law.
Nearly 50 people have been arrested after a night of rioting in North London.
The media was hardly sympathetic to the rioters either. There was condemnation of the violence, and everybody seemed to have their own theory about the causes.
The whites have become black.
But amidst the hysteria, there was also grief, as 4 people were killed in the riots. So was it simply mindless thuggery that was behind the August unrest? Well, 4 months on, a study by the London School of Economics and the Guardian newspaper reveals that the causes ran deeper than the Prime Minister suggested. Whereas Cameron quashed the disturbances as pure criminality devoid of any political meaning, the report, consisting of interviews with 270 rioters, reveals a deep antipathy towards the police.
What I'm against is the system that we live in, the unfair system that we live in. I find it hard to have respect for people who don't have respect for me.
Right.
I don't say it's right to burn down your own area where you live, but what I am saying is they're crying out.
Many Muslims who took part in the riots also spoke about the discrimination by the police, saying that this had fueled their anger and lawlessness. Some of the young men interviewed said they'd been picked on for having long beards. Others said they'd been on the receiving end of Islamophobic taunts, with officers likening them to Osama bin Laden.
I've had friends who've told me that they have called them Pakis, they've called them bin Laden's son, stupid things like that. Obviously things to wind them up, so police officers then have an excuse to arrest you. I don't hate the policing system. I hate the police on the street. I hate them from the bottom of my heart. I hate them with so much hate that you do not understand. From the age of 13, I am getting abuse.
The rioters interviewed for the Guardian LSE report cite the same reasons for the unrest. They talk about government spending cuts and increased tuition fees and how this has pushed them further into a state of poverty and disenchantment with the government. Many spoke of the anger they felt after the corporate crimes which led to the economic crisis and the lack of accountability of the bankers. But moreover, they complained of the unfair treatment by the police, something which led many to say they'd attack officers again if they got the chance.
With me in the studio to discuss this is Paul Anderson Walsh, who is the Managing Director of the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, which was set up after the Macpherson Report, which found that the police were institutionally racist. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my great pleasure.
And on the phone we have with us Andrew Pilkington, who's a Professor of Sociology at Northampton University and has written widely on issues relating to race and ethnicity. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
If I can turn to you first. What do you make of the report by The Guardian and the LSE?
I think the issues, Summer, are very complicated. I was watching the package there and just thinking to myself, it's too easy almost to be able to say, on the one hand, it's lawlessness, on the other hand, it's all politically motivated. I think there's a kind of overall sense that I'm gripped with every time I see or read anything about the riots that says to me there is a kind of very deep sense of meaninglessness that has gripped our society. obviously as spiritual people yourselves, you will have, I'm sure, take a very similar view to me around this, which is that there's a famous piece of wisdom literature that says, where there is no vision, the people cast off restraint. And one of the things that I'm very worried about is I'm worried about the fact that we seem to be a very visionless society. And I kind of feel that maybe underneath some of this, and I'd be very interested to hear what Andrew, as a sociologist, will say, but underneath the surface, and what you're seeing here at the riot level, is the outworking of the behaviour. But underneath that, there is a belief system that seems to be driving the thinking, which in turn is driving the behaviour, and it's getting at that I'm interested in. It's a very, very distressing situation, because it really does say to me that when people cast off restraints, and where there is this kind of lawlessness, whatever way you want to shape it, then that's telling you there's some serious problems within our society that we simply can't dismiss as just hooliganism. It's much more fundamental than that.
Well, let's come back to what you think that core belief or unbelief
unbelief, yeah, absolutely.
may be. If I come to you, Andrew, what do you make of the report? Do you think it captures the complexities? Because it doesn't say it's just one reason or another. It seems to go out of its way to say there are a multitude of reasons behind the riots.
Yes. I mean, I think it's an excellent report. I think the initial response to the 2011 riots was that they were radically different from, say, the riots in the 1980s or 90s, or indeed in the noughties. But I think what the report brings out very clearly is some similarities that the trigger for the riot was a sense by some participants, by a lot of participants, that the police had been harassing them. I mean, that was a very, very significant finding. But the report also highlights that underneath the riots, there's massive inequality, high consumer expectations, and a sense of relative deprivation. So I think my reading of the report is that it's a good document that brings out distinctively the trigger, which is the sense of, by a lot of the youngsters, of police harassment, but also presents the sort of the variety of motivations involved, and also the underlying structural factors, particularly of inequality and high consumer expectations.
Do you think it's difficult for a report like this to get a fair hearing almost? Because if you start talking about issues like police harassment or inequalities, people are very easily shouted down by others saying, well, look, it's just pure criminality. And even talking about this makes it sound like you're making excuses for people.
Yes, I mean, there is that problem, because, I mean, the initial response, as your brief intro showed, was this is pure criminality. And that, of course, is the typical political response to outrageous behaviour, such as was exemplified in the riot. But it clearly isn't pure criminality. It is criminality, but it is also other things as well. And I think the report brings out, as I say, the complexity and the fact that you can't just divide up motivations into this is looting and criminality, or it's political rebellion. It can be both. But you're right. I mean, once you start trying to explain things, trying to understand things, it looks as though you're trying to excuse them. But I think you can do both. I think you can condemn the behaviour, but show it's understandable given certain structural factors, such as the degree of deprivation people are feeling, the break-up in some cases of communities, and the continuing kind of emphasis on materialism as the be-all and end-all of life.
Well, jumping off from the point of materialism there, I mean, it was one of the things that was highlighted in the report was that how many young people felt that consumer pressure. It was quite remarkable that many of the trainer shops, for example, were looted, whereas other more expensive items perhaps weren't, showing that branding and that kind of consciousness certainly is a big factor in young people.
Yeah, and I think Andrew's point is compelling, because I think, you know, we have absolutely sleptwalked into this, that really this piece about consumerism and that demand for that is really very strong. And also we're living in a society where we've managed now to somehow confuse the idea of being successful and equate that as being famous. And so now, curiously, you can just go on a television show, appear for 5 minutes, and you're a celebrity. There's a lot of the sort of ethic and the attitude that sits underneath it that's really very, very different. different. But I think, there's been someone who lived through, given this started, if you think the match was struck perhaps in Tottenham with the murder of Mark Duggan.
And of course that kind of got lost as well, that
Yeah,
point
that's
about
right.
how this started.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that's so difficult about this is this is a very nice opportunity to kind of, displace oneself from what is a core point. And the core point is a young black man was killed at the hands of the Metropolitan Police. Now that surely someone needs to answer some questions about that. Now, whether or not that merits what happens is a separate point.
But then, of course, there was the issue that the police did not inform the family, and then there's allegation that there was misinformation, that the police actually alleged that they were shot at by the young man, and therefore it was anger at the lack of information and then perhaps the distortion of information that led to the initial rioting. Would that be an accurate assessment?
I think that's right. I think maybe one of the other things that may be a factor, because I'm old enough sadly to remember the Broadwater Farm instance. I'm old enough to remember, Andrew, I don't know if you recall the Blair Peach incident all those many years ago. Yeah. And one of the things that is very different today, as opposed to in the 80s, is social media adds a totally different spin on things. And so now you've got something that can virally happen so quickly, which couldn't have happened before. And it would be interesting to know whether or not if the social media tools that are present today were present in Southall, or were present in Brixton, or were present in Tottenham. I wonder or not whether Scarman's report would have ended up being something rather different to it was. I wonder if it would, an explosion of this nature. So I think there are lots of modern factors. I think that the consumerism is undoubtedly a factor. You're absolutely right. I mean, I watched a BBC documentary during a Newsnight, I think it was, during that riot, and they were saying, it's curious that no one's broken into Waterstones, and there was, it was all very ATE. But actually, it's a serious point, and I think you've made it very well, that people were just grabbing at what they somehow thought they were entitled to in a culture that's created that kind of rather bizarre sense. And I think that what I'm worried about is that your community, I'm worried about the black community, I'm worried about the communities, the already socially disadvantaged, being sort of marginalised still further over this issue, because number one, it wasn't simply a black or an Asian issue. I mean, but yet when you watch the portrayal, you watch the television, there's one extraordinary news clip where they had all white looters and the background music against it was a reggae track, and you say, well, what are you trying to tell me here? And I'm worried about that because there are within the black and ethnic minority community, there are people that would be as incensed and as outraged, and people who have value sets that are, so beyond what we're looking at here. And I think those voices might get lost as well, which frightens me.
Well, of course, we had David Starkey claiming that the whites had become black, and I come from Birmingham, and it was 3 Asian Muslim young men who lost their lives in defending the community. So we know very well that the oversimplification of race is not the answer here. But as somebody who looks at these issues, would you agree that just as in the 80s there was there was a real anger towards the police from the black community about how they'd been treated, that somehow that hasn't all been addressed even post Macpherson, and now we have another generation of Muslim young people who've had the experience of stop and search, have had the demonisation post 9/11, and feel there is that distance between them and authorities.
Can I answer that?
Of course, I directed that to you, Andrew.
Yes, I mean, I think stop and search has been a sort of key factor that the report has highlighted as really critical. If we go back to the Scarman report, it criticised the use of sus laws and said we needed to replace them with stop and search, whereby the police had reasonable grounds for suspicion. Later, the Macpherson Report says we need actually to make the police accountable indeed for stop and account, so that we need forms for that. So this issue of stop and search has been a long-standing issue where there's been disproportionality. In other words, black people have been much more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. Now, the situation has actually got worse rather than better, because not only are black people 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched now than white people, but Asian people are twice as likely to be stopped and searched than white people, when 10 years ago they weren't. So stop and search is disproportionate. Very few arrests arise from stop and search. There's fewer forms being filled out for stop and account than there were, so the police are less accountable. And yet, quite clearly, what the report demonstrates is that stop and search is extraordinarily alienating. You only need a few officers to target. You only need a few officers to disrespect people, and that message gets around and around and around. And clearly both black youngsters, Asian youngsters, and indeed white youngsters that are the subject of this report are really alienated by the use of stop and search. And I agree totally with Tim Newburn when he says that we need to rethink, the police needs to rethink its use of stop and search. It's used quite differently in different forces, but it's very questionable as to whether it's effective in terms of crime reduction, where it clearly is very effective in terms of alienating minority communities. And then just one final point. I mean, Jack Straw, in the light of the Macpherson Report, declared a ministerial priority, police gaining the trust of minority communities, Muslims and black people and so forth. And quite clearly that has not succeeded. That was 2000. And here we are in 2011 with a very significant minority, of young people, extraordinarily alienated, just as they were in the 1980s. So I think this is a particularly disturbing feature. The police have made some significant progress in certain directions, but on this particular issue, I'm afraid, against the backdrop of inequality, there's tremendous alienation.
Well, the report certainly highlights that. If I can just move away from the stop and search element, an interesting thing for me when I looked at the report was it did highlight also that the public were very angry that the police had focused very much on the retail areas, but communities themselves felt abandoned. And that was another reason why young people, some of them said, well, actually it was an opportunity. When people heard that the police were not responding, some people may not have got drawn into it. Again, not an excuse for it, but an explanation of how perhaps this spread so quickly. They were watching the telly, hearing that the police are not responding, well, they thought, well, we'll have a go as well.
Yeah, and
if I can put this to Paul.
No, I think that's right, and you know, it's the whole thing is such a tawdry tale, isn't it? And forgive me just to step back 1 second, if you don't mind. But listen to Andrew talk about Macpherson. You know, it reminds me that Macpherson had the 70 points on the Macpherson inquiry, and one of the things that leaves me a little cold, Andrew, if I'll be honest, is that I recently spoke at the Metropolitan Police Diversity Awards afternoon, which is actually rather interesting. And one of the things that I said in my address to them was that, you know, the constant challenge to our community is, do we trust the police? Well, actually, that's not the question. The question is, do the police trust our community? And as long as the police don't trust our community, then we're going to have this alienation. And I don't think you'd be overly cynical, and by no means do I have a political agenda, but I don't think one would be overly cynical to think that the scary part for me is that it feels like we're almost living in an age where we have to have something that we can be afraid of, because if we have something we can be afraid of, that in itself gives me the ability to control you and to put in all sorts of measures. So, you know, 20 years ago, it was about demonising the black community.
The Asian community were the good people, and
they
were hard-working with their families, and now the Asian community, or the Muslim community, does certainly feel that it's being demonised and seen as that
very, very
problem.
Disturbing. But what is that about? It's all about division, it's all about divisiveness, it's all about separation, and that to me is the big problem, because, and then if you add into that stop and search, you drive that alienation so deeply into our communities that, you know, we really are going to end up with a broken society, and it's very, very disturbing that that's happening. But yes, I agree with your opportunity to steal point.
Well,
is
to move
right.
on to a more positive aspect,
yes,
because of course
please.
there was a minority of people who got involved in this, so the opportunity was there for many, many other young people who didn't take it up, who also were from deprived backgrounds. How would you describe that resilience? I mean, that part of it has obviously been highlighted as much as what's gone wrong, but clearly it could have been far worse.
Could have been far worse. Well, I'm thrilled that you're wanting to talk about the positive, because I think that's really important. The Stephen Lawrence Trust, for instance, if I may just use us as an example, our whole reason to exist, the reason why we came into being, was because a young black man who was 18 years of age was unlawfully killed at a bus stop, and the subsequent investigation into that death has obviously given rise to Macpherson and everything else. But what the trust was set up to do was, it was set up because the Lawrence family said to themselves, is it possible for good to come out of something bad? And here we had a situation whereby Stephen wanted to become an architect, and that desire was taken from him. And so they passed that desire on to other people. Now what's interesting is that, to me, when I look at institutional racism, when I look at the problems that we're discussing today, it's all about attitude. Social injustice, social mobility is an attitude issue. It's attitudes that cause the problem, and it's only attitudes that will solve the problem. Now, our whole work at the Stephen Lawrence Trust is about what we call the Stephens, and our belief is that we identify these young, diligent, ambitious, resilient, to use your nice word, hard-working people, and we essentially prepare them to enter into underrepresented professions with a view that they will model an attitude that will modify the attitudes of the organisations and institutions in which they work. And the truth of the matter is, there were a lot more Stephens, those that weren't out on the street and rioting, than there were those who...
Exactly.
And that's missing, and I think we've got to really speak that message, because today we're living in an environment where you can bet your bottom dollar that there'll be money poured at the riots to because it's defensive. There's money poured at the gifted and talented, but there are a whole invisible middle. If I may use Daily Mail language, the middle Englanders that are sitting in the middle, the 80–90% of our community who are Stephens. They are good people that if you took them seriously and invested some time in them, they themselves would be able to modify the attitudes that are seeming to come to the fore in our community. But we choose not to.
Well, it seems there is some hope out of all this tragedy by looking at what hasn't happened. There were many, many young people, many people who had opportunity and did not get involved in that. And also we saw some real heroes, as well as the people who helped to clean up and bring communities together at a time of great pressure and great fear. Please do join us same time next week. And let me thank both of our guests. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Don't forget, you can tweet us and also you can watch us on YouTube. Do join us same time next week.